replace documents and move to the final annual budget and the mayoral proposal, and I'll ask the Mayor to speak. And the Mayor has the exception, as he's got 10 minutes, but we can extend that. So there is an exception, instead of 5 minutes, it's 10 minutes for the mayoral proposal. And if people want, if it's required, any extra time. So I'll just ask the Mayor first, do you want to move your recommendations A to F?
Yes, Mr Chairman, I'll move recommendations A to F together.
Right, well, I'll second those. And Mayor Goff.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr Chairman, councillors and members of the public. I would first of all like to thank our officials in working through this budget process. They have acted with absolute commitment and professionalism, and I have real confidence in the quality of the staff that we've had advising us on that. So my personal thanks to them. I'd also like to thank councillors around this table. I don't know, I haven't counted how many workshops we've had. They've been numerous, and councillors have put hard work into getting their heads around the challenges that we face. We won't agree on everything in these proposals, but I do accept that every councillor is motivated to do the right thing by their city. The briefings that we've received really have highlighted the challenges that we face as a city with extraordinary levels of growth. 45,000 people added to our city each year. They've also highlighted that infrastructure over many years has failed to keep up with that growth, and we're paying the price for that. We're paying the price for it in terms of unaffordability of housing and growing congestion on our roads. The level of investment in infrastructure we need in this city now is huge. The problem is that our city has limited ability to borrow. With the $1.7 billion that we are contributing towards the CRL, the only city in this country required to pay for heavy rail infrastructure, we are at the limits of our debt to revenue ratio. Borrowing by itself cannot be an answer to our problems. When so many Aucklanders in recent years have been faced with double-digit rate increases, nor is it an easy answer that we can simply continue to burden our ratepayers with continuing high levels of rate increases. So this council has got some hard decisions to make. We shouldn't shy away from those decisions. We were elected to make those decisions and to have the courage to do so. I've set out 3 priorities in this budget. Firstly, rating stability, after what I've just described as years of high rate increases and volatility. I'm proposing a 2.5% rate increase, and that's a reduction from what the long-term plan proposed for this year. I'm also proposing a 1-year pause in reducing the business residential differential rate to allow us to deliver that 2.5% rate increase. By doing this, we are effectively passing on to our residents and ratepayers the efficiency savings that this council has made, and also the lower costs in terms of interest rates and lower inflation that enable us to do that. My second priority is support for our most vulnerable Aucklanders. I'm proposing a living wage to be introduced by this council over a 3-year period. In my view, our employees deserve a wage that they can live and raise their families on. A living wage would also, I think, reduce the 25% attrition rate that exists amongst our lower paid workers, and that will enable this council to increase productivity and reduce training costs. With homelessness growing in our cities, and you would have heard reports on the radio just this morning about how they estimate it has doubled, I'm also proposing that Council should fund coordination of efforts by ourselves, by government agencies and NGOs to adopt a housing first policy to help first and foremost those people who are rough sleeping. This policy has proven effective in other parts of New Zealand and internationally in addressing the problem of homelessness and the factors behind that led to people sleeping rough. My third priority is to create financial headroom through increased revenue to allow us to increase infrastructure investment and to address our housing and our transport problems. The critical work here, as you'll be aware, will be done in the long-term plan. We have to resolve issues such as revenue sharing from central government, and the first challenge to address there will be in the Housing Infrastructure Fund, and we will need road pricing to meet the Auckland Transport Alignment Project deficit, which was set at $4 billion, and we have now been advised is likely to be in excess of $7 billion over the next 10 years. Putting that deficit alone on rates would result in a 20 to 30% rate increase. That is unthinkable. In the annual budget, we propose broadening Council's revenue base by two means. Firstly, a targeted rate on accommodation. Secondly, a targeted rate on major property developments. Both measures will provide fairer outcomes for our general ratepayers. Under this proposal, ratepayers will pay half, not 100%, of the $26 million that ATED will be spending on promoting tourism to Auckland and in marketing events. The targeted rate on development will lower the burden on general ratepayers of infrastructure for new housing subdivisions. It may also prove effective in helping to discourage land banking. As you said, Mr Chairman, some 8,000 plus people participated in our consultation process. That is 3 times higher than last year. And those people expressed by a 2/3 majority support for each of the major proposals I'm putting forward in this budget. And that support was consistent across the region. If we ignore what members of the general public have told us in that process, they will rightly question us on why their votes counted for nothing and why they should bother again to participate in a consultation process. We need to take their views seriously. On the targeted accommodation rate, there was opposition, and sometimes strident opposition, from an interest group that was well organised, well funded, and had access to expensive lawyers and professional lobbyists to promote their position. And the sad thing about politics is that too often lobby groups prevail over the wider community because the wider community are not organised in the same way. I have a very clear view that it is our role as elected representatives to speak on behalf of our communities, not on behalf of organised lobby groups. Most of the mayoral proposals are largely unchanged from those that we put out for consultation. The living wage, the 2.5% rate increase, and pausing the rate differential are unchanged. Each of those had overwhelming public support. The targeted rate on accommodation providers also had overwhelming public support. But the proposal as reported back is changed because we have listened to and we have responded to the issues that have been raised by those directly affected by it. The industry is now being asked to share only half of the cost of marketing and events from which they are the direct beneficiaries. For most hotels, the impact on nightly room rates is between $3 and $6. For motels, it's between $1 and $3. You all heard yesterday from our legal staff their opinion and the opinions that they have received from Simpson Grierson and David Goddard QC that these proposals are in order and are within our statutory authority. They are confident that Council can decide to adopt the proposed rate and that the requirements set out in the Local Government Act, the Fair Trading Act and the Commerce Act have all been met. They are absolutely clear that if providers choose to do so, they can pass on the targeted rate, which then in effect becomes a levy on visitors, in the same way as they pass on all their other business costs. And last year they found it possible to put up the average daily rate by a massive 16%. It is, of course, up to individual providers to decide how they do that, whether they bundle up that cost in the overall charge or whether they separate it and describe it as a surcharge. They need to take their own legal advice on the way that they can do that within the law. But on the basis of our legal advice, we can confidently decide to set this rate and know that most providers can pass on the rate if they so choose. There are a few cases where costs cannot be passed on, and we have put in place a remission policy so that those people can be dealt with fairly. I think the importance of this rate is not simply that it relieves the pressure on our ratepayers and it is fairly shared with our ratepayers, but that the savings that we make, some $100 million over 6 years, will both relieve the pressure on our debt to revenue ratio and will mean our ability to significantly add to investment in transport infrastructure. That investment will benefit the businesses affected, it will benefit our visitors to the city, and it will also benefit Aucklanders across the board. It's likely that the revenue we gain will be focused on providing mass transit from the CBD to the airport, and of course, being the gateway city of New Zealand, we cannot continue to tolerate that gateway being clogged in the way that it is now. Passing this measure will also strongly assist our future plans to broaden our revenue base. There's been much talk around this table of the fact that when we put in infrastructure paid for by the ratepayer, there's value uplift and a windfall profit to developers whose properties are alongside the infrastructure that we create. If we want to do that, there will be fierce resistance to it. And this council today can show that we have the courage to do the right thing by our community and not buckle under pressure from individual interest groups. We do need to take tough decisions. We have to find savings. We have to improve council's efficiency. But those things alone, as important as they may be, do not provide the level of funding that we need for our major investment needs. We have to broaden our sources of revenue to fund huge infrastructure costs. Ratepayers cannot be called on to fund that alone. As elected representatives of our city, it's our duty to lead the change, to make decisions on behalf of the wider community and not to concede our decision-making to narrow interest groups. I want to thank all councillors here, both those who are in support of this proposal, but also those who are challenging it. I believe that this has been a valuable and constructive exercise. I believe that this is a fair budget that presents us with the opportunity to be bold, and it will demonstrate that we are a council ready to act resolutely to address the challenges facing our city. That's what we need to do now, and that's what we'll need to do even more when we address the funding challenges and constraints as we adopt a long-term plan over the coming months. Thank you very much, Mr Chairman, for your indulgence, and thank you very much, councillors, for your attention. Kia ora.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Right, we'll ask Matthew to come up, Matthew Walker, who is there to answer any questions about any of the attachments. But what I want to do is to make sure that we deal with A and B initially, specifically, okay? So I'm not going to vote on them, but just for discussions, and if we can keep it clean and get through our questions and debate on those two topics, which is the rate rise and the differential, because I'm putting them together, so to speak, because they do impart on each other. And then then that allows us to focus on the accommodation targeted rate after that, and Councillors Hulse and Cooper can leave, and we just work on C. We then finish that debate, those question time and debate, and then come back and do the last three items where Councillor Hulse and Councillor Cooper can come back. And then we will go through the same procedure when we go to vote. Okay, so Matthew and Andrew. Welcome.
Don't need to press it. Automatic.
Thanks, Mr Chair.
Sorry, just Matthew, I should actually, one thing I did forget. I've had two motions, two amendments put forward to me. One was by Denise Crum and Christine Fletcher, and then also Councillor Sayers, who didn't have a seconder, but I'm taking that we're going to table Councillor Crum and Councillor Fletcher's amendment first, because, sorry, Councillor Lee. Councillor Lee, and we're going to take that as the first amendment, and because Councillor Sayers' amendment was effectively exactly the same, that does not need to go up. So, Matthew.
Thanks, Mr Chairman. So perhaps if I just take a couple of moments. I mean, we stepped through staff advice yesterday, but perhaps it's just worthwhile quickly going back through that to assist in your debate on the first issue in front of you there, which is quite relevant. The Mayor has made the points clear, but equally in our advice, supporting your decision making today and supporting his proposal, we've been pretty keen to reinforce the context around the Council's budget. And so we spoke yesterday, and it's contained in our report, those significant issues around city growth and really just the one-to-one relationship with the pace of that growth and the pressure on council's expenditure, particularly in key infrastructure areas. We highlighted, and we well understand it, and it's key to your decision making, that the issue is one of balance. So on the one hand, you have that challenge and opportunity of the rapidly growing city, but on the other, you've got this tough issue of balancing that up against affordability for ratepayers. And you're well aware, over the last year or two, we've taken some time to explain to you also the significant constraints in terms of the council's balance sheet, and we've talked at some length around the critical levels for our debt to revenue ratios that indeed are kind of now on the table in regards to this budget. So we stepped through that yesterday, but it's important to just reinforce that aspect of context around our advice. If I just make one other point, and then we have prepared just a single slide that was requested to help your debate around the rates. Kylie's mentioned this, but it's perhaps just worth further reinforcement in terms of the overall budget process. So today is decisions and approvals. The team need to bring together, based on those decisions and approvals today, final documents for adoption at the end of the month. And I think it's perhaps also just worth stressing, lest we forget we can't spend all of our time in planning mode, that's all about giving the organisation some budget certainty to work with and actually implement the program for next year. So we're certainly keen to be able to bring together that final document for adoption at the end of this month based on today's decisions. Mike, is it possible to throw that slide up?
Working on it.
So all I wanted to do here was use a slide, talk through it, and really it just helps you think about that trade-off on the 2.5 to 3.5 type debate.
Technology is letting us down, but we do have
It's been handed
old-fashioned
round as
paper
well.
version.
Thank you.
So hopefully this helps a little bit with the picture tells 1,000 words. It's a financial version of a picture, so it's kind of a chart really, or a table. I want to keep this nice and simple. What we're saying here is you do have in front of you from the Mayor's proposal, based on our advice, a set of operating and capital budgets that enable us to balance A, at a 2.5% increase in the general rate for next year, but B, at a level in terms of that key balance sheet ratio where we would be sitting at about the 265% mark over the next 3 to 4 years, remembering, councils, that forward context is critical to your decision making, particularly in light of some of those LTP pressures we've talked about. But the language we've used here is to say that all borrowing capacity is consumed at that point. So what are we saying there? We're simply saying that the organisation's ability at this point to fund further capital expenditure, investment in infrastructure, on top of what was already programmed through the LTP is close to zero without us identifying some other moving parts. And indeed, that's what we're pretty keen to try and tackle and work with you on through the LTP. But in terms of your budget at the moment, we are at our revised projections for debt to revenue do see us at that 265% level, and therefore we think it's important that your decisions today have regard for that, and that's consistent with the advice we've provided. So what's on either side of the 2.5? It's really the levels that were in the consultation document, and we held a discussion with Aucklanders on and received some feedback on it. And we just wanted to re-clarify for your debate today kind of some key bottom lines really around contemplating a movement away from the 2.5 mark. So if we first look at the opportunity to reduce the general rate increase down to 2, we're saying two things. First thing we're saying, and the overall general rates take is at around the 1.5 billion mark. So for the mathematicians, 1% of that is 15 million, and if you halve that, that's how you get the 7.4 million. So the first thing we would need to do is identify hard savings of 7.4 million in our operating budgets to be able to responsibly lower the general rate increase to 2%. You've heard management consistently on this. We've had some good discussions with business operators over the last month, and it's management's strong view that we don't have any ability to take those operating budgets lower for next year without contemplating frontline service level impacts. And our sense of your response to that discussion is we haven't detected any enthusiasm from councillors to shift the discussion to one that contemplates a reduction in frontline services. So we're simply making the point that there's a wee challenge there in terms of debating the 2% level, and I think we've been pretty clear and consistent with that. The other thing we're saying, and that's really because the budget now is kind of, think of it as anchored off these two different aspects, the operating budget and therefore the general rate increase, but also the balance sheet in terms of the relationship between council's overall debt and revenue levels. So therefore, having regard for that and the fact that we have already revised our projections to 265% in around 3 or 4 years' time, but that becomes real today because we've got to get on with those projects. What we're also pointing out here is that any debate around a cut in the general rate to 2% would also need to identify a further 20 million reduction in all likelihood in our capital expenditure program to offset what would otherwise be an adverse impact in that debt to revenue ratio, because what you're doing when you lower the rates to 2% is you're lowering our overall revenue take, and it's just straight maths. So that's on one side of the equation, and we know, and it was a good consultation that was held with Aucklanders, plenty of feedback around this issue, and I can't quite remember exactly how the numbers fell, but certainly there was majority support in the middle at 2.5, but there were also those with some preference at 2, and indeed some preference at 3.5, and probably aligned to the notion and the recognition that at a higher rate increase, council can do more. And no surprises there, that's exactly the case. So what does 3.5 look like? Firstly, it looks like we would raise around 14.8, close to 15 million a year. That is then able to be allocated. What you allocate that to would be your decision, but my suspicion would be first cab off the rank would be thinking about funding more of our capital program and supporting infrastructure projects with that annual budget. And that would be free cash available year on year. So, for example, over a 5-year period, you're freeing up about 75 to 80 million to support a decent size of infrastructure investment. The other issue at the bottom there is simply the balance sheet piece and our ability to borrow. So the 14.8 would be recurring, ongoing each year. At the bottom, because of the way our borrowing works, we're able to effectively leverage a little bit that additional revenue and borrow around 2.5 times that revenue amount, and also have that increased capacity to support infrastructure investment. So, Mr. Chair, that was mainly all I wanted to go through there. We've got Andrew here as well to step through some of the other rating policy matters, but if I'm reading you right on how you want to operate the discussion, we can perhaps pause there and take questions.
I think we will pause and we'll just deal with questions and then debate. Now, I have several people who put their hands up. Councillor Cashmore, do you have a question, or was yours comment for later?
Later.
Later, okay. And Councillor Sayers?
Comment for later, Mr. Chair.
And Councillor Holtz?
I wish to speak to the amendment or against the amendment.
Okay, so no questions. Okay. Councillor Casey, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about the pledge, since it's been in the media and there's been a lot of, in my absence, discussion around it. That was a pledge that may have been signed by a number of councillors to keep the rates to 2%. I'm looking for some legal response to people who want to change their mind about that. And the whole idea of open-mindedness with regard to coming to this meeting to make decisions.
Well,
Well, Mr. Chairman, if you're going to
I understand that threats have been issued to councillors who may have signed the pledge.
Pledges, whether it relates to a specific issue like living wage pledges, I think pledges are part of the political environment that we work in.
I understand that some councillors who signed a pledge were threatened. I've only read it in the media, but that concerns me.
Point of order,
That any councillor would feel.
Chair, I think this is irrelevant to the direct debate. That's a political discussion to be had amongst politicians. I don't think it's relevant.
I don't want councillors to feel that they're under any duress today because of anything that might have happened.
but to be quite honest, again,
Threatened by our lawyers.
what you're referring to happened in a confidential closed workshop as well, so
No,
we simply cannot comment about that. So
No, it didn't. It didn't. The feathers were given out publicly, I think. I don't know, I didn't get one.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Just speaks to relevance again, that point of order. I can get the number out if you like, but I'd just like a ruling on
I
that.
agree. Sorry, Councillor
Yeah.
Casey, but we hear what you're saying, and I mean, obviously, Councillor Fletcher's quite right there. She's talking about there's pledges all over the place. I mean, mayoral candidates, all had a fixed view, if you want to say, if it came to a rate rise or whatever, so that's kind of a pledge as well. And then people who voted for, whether it be a mayoral candidate saying 2% or a mayoral candidate saying 2.5%, or in ways pledging support for that. So, I mean, I think...
Yeah, but my candidate was saying no rate increase, and he's not even here.
It's a lesson in that.
But it's those that signed.
Councillor
the
Casey, do you
pledge
have
that we
another
did
question? do you have any other question?
It was more that no.
Yeah.
Councillor Hills,
Keep saying no.
do you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to speak to the amendment, but just one question. I'm not sure if you're able to answer, Matthew, but this is a great diagram and part of our questions from yesterday. But what the diagram doesn't show for the 2.5, what savings you're already making to keep to the 2.5. We've had every department come in and tell us the millions of dollars they're saving. So I don't know if you have the information in front of you, but could you give us a ballpark of what actually is also being saved to keep to the 2.5 or get down to the 2.5?
So through the chair, plenty has already been saved. In terms of running the slide rule on that, this is year 3 of the first LTP where we had hardwired into council budgets an additional 17 million of savings this in the FY18 financial year. That was on top of 25 in the current year. So we do what we do every year and look at all the numbers and walk through all of the pressures across all of the departments and all of the CCOs. Typically that exercise, and this year was no different, flushes out other cost pressures, and they're typically non-trivial and they need to be thought about and need to be factored in. So what I would say for the record, and we've shared this through the information we've made available to you, in a net sense, next year's budget is premised on being able to ensure that we honour the 17 million saving originally factored in, and on top of that a further net 11. So the best part of 30 million of savings across the group for next year to balance to 2.5.
Yep. So 2.5, we're already saving 30, but to get to 2 we'd have to save another 8.
Yes, and not stop there. You would also have to have a discussion about a further 20, would be our advice.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Councillor Simpson, was yours a question?
No, sorry, sir. It's a comment.
Councillor Walker.
Mine's just
And
a
Walker. Yep.
just a procedural question, Mr. Chair, and that is later in the agenda we've got item C, which goes to the accommodation targeted rate, and that's a fairly structural decision. Should we be dealing with a decision around the overall rate before that decision? Because depending on which way that decision goes, we may need to adjust the overall rate. So I would have thought we would have dealt with the accommodation targeted rate first.
The order,
example, on my part,
the order we have and the order in the paper was basically just being consistent with how we consulted. So we did debate whether we should do a different order, but we decided no, it was to be consistent. That was the way it was going to be. As I say, I'm faced with this. Well, we're faced with this not difficulty, but we've got 2 people with a conflict that we really cannot be crisscrossing into C with those people in the room, and nor do they want to be in the room. So I'm afraid we're going to have to run it fairly tight. So what we can do, and I'm at for the meeting we're doing A and B here. We can take an amendment after the debate and deal with the amendment, and then if that amendment is passed, then that becomes the substantive element later. If it isn't passed, then the substantive or the mayoral recommendation stands. We would then move to C to have questions and debate on that, and then at the end of doing A and B and C separately, and then the next 3, we would come back and have a final vote on the substantive motions as they stand, A to F.
okay, through you, Mr. Chair, that doesn't satisfy me. I think the issue is not the order in which we did some consultation with the public, but the order should be what's the most rational way to make decisions. Given that the accommodation targeted rate has a significant influence on the overall rate, we should deal with it first. It's very messy otherwise. We could end up passing something and then being in an invidious situation where we really need to come back to it later. And what do we do then? Maybe the officers might give us some advice there.
Well,
And the significance
this
of
is
that,
what... Look,
we're not talking about a small amount of money.
Councillor Walker, sometimes what you think is rational and what others might think is rational can be differ. So we've decided this is the order we're going to do it in, and I'm sorry about that, but that's the way it is. So, have you got any further questions on A?
Yes, I do.
Yes? Councillor Newman, sorry.
Mr. Chair, whilst you've made a ruling, the issue is the functionality of the budget based on the ordering of the voting here. I, in consultation with some colleagues, proposed actually a 3.5% rate increase, which would mean, well, which is consistent with the long-term plan. I took your advice from your previous position, and that we would be able to tag 1% of that to pay for the tourist promotion work of a TEED. And if we adopted that position, then we might be in a better position to tackle the accommodation rate debate later on. But if we are going to be resolving this particular part of the budget now, ahead of that targeted rate, it makes it very difficult for us to introduce into the discussion later matters that I think could be easily addressed if we were able to address the targeted rate proportion of the debate now and clarify this matter so that when we come back to this one, we're fully informed.
Two things going on there. I'm aware that you were thinking about tabling an amendment, but you have not.
I didn't declare I was going to table an amendment.
Okay, all right. So, at the moment, and I think this is the third time, we're not going to make a final vote on A and B until we've gone through C, D, E and F. Then we will come back to do the vote. So we're just trying to deal with this difficult situation. We've got two people with a conflict, and if you really think it's sensible that we just have two people getting up and down and up and down and out of the room and back again for a number of hours, I personally think that that is actually ridiculous. So, are there any further questions? Councillor Lee, Mike Lee.
Mr. Chairman, I have to agree with Councillor Wayne Walker. It seems to me a reversal of the process to determine the level of rates and then debate how they're to be made up after that. I really do think that we should be debating the components of the rate increase prior to striking or recommending striking the final rate. That is the normal convention when striking a rate. Otherwise, the outcome is pretty much predetermined and the debate after is somewhat academic. I don't think that is due process. The Council is going to be under a lot of scrutiny in terms of its process, in terms of its consultation, particularly in regard to the targeted rate, and particularly how it has responded to consultation with the targeted rate. So I would urge, Mr. Chairman, you revert to the conventional approach and we will discuss the components of the rates increase before deciding on the level. That's my request. I also have an amendment.
Okay, so does anyone else have a question?
Not about that.
Not about that? Oh. Okay, so let us also be quite clear that there is a general rate and there are targeted rates. We're actually voting on two targeted rates here today. So let us not just try and blend them together. Of course, in some people's minds they are blended, but they're not. We're striking a general rate and we're striking possibly two other targeted rates. So they're separate items and that's how we're going to deal with them. So Councillor Hills.
Well, your ruling is final, so I was just going to back that up, that we have discussed this what feels like hundreds of times. We all know what's on the table, and the fact is we are voting first on to balance a budget on what percentage it is, and then we're potentially adding other revenue streams through voting on other targeted rates. So I support the way you're doing it.
So what I'm going to do as a compromise is we're not going to vote on the amendment until we've actually gone through A, B, C and D, and then we'll come back and vote on the amendment, any amendments first, and then go to the substantive.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes,
I
Councillor.
don't think that that's the right way to go about the
What is
order.
the point of order?
Just what I said.
No, it's not a point of order.
Okay, fine.
Okay, so I'm actually getting the word that
The
no,
chair
perhaps
rules
it's
on
best
that,
we
not
do
you.
vote on the amendments and then we go back. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so now we're going to go through a roll call here. We have Councillor Cashmore, we have Sayers, we have Hulse, Councillor Wayne Walker, Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Simpson and Councillor Hills.
Point of order.
Speaking.
Mr. Chairman, I understood that the mover of the amendment should be given the right to speak first. She's had her hand up, and I would have thought that she would have the opportunity to introduce it and explain her rationale behind it.
Fair enough. Yep.
Are there any other amendments? Oh, sorry, I
have a
didn't see your hand,
question
Councillor
still.
Lee. Are there any other amendments that are going to go up?
Question?
A question? Yes?
It's not about that.
Oh.
It's about following on from Councillor Hill's earlier, and it's a question of Matthew. Matthew, you talked about the 2% rate increase and what would happen as a result. Can you just give me a yes or no answer on this? The libraries have already been asked to give up 1.8 million. If the 2% went through, would that require a cut to service levels or closures of libraries? Because at the moment, the library management tell us there is no cuts to service levels at the current time. If the 2% went through, would there be?
They're already cutting services, cutting staff.
Okay, well, Matthew, could you answer the question, please?
Well, what I would do is just repeat what I've said. So if 2% went through, you're telling management that they've got to cut the operating budgets by 7.4, so management would need to come back and show you how to do that.
So it's a yes.
Maybe.
A maybe. Right. Thank you.
Possibly, yes.
Possibly yes.
Right,
see
so
that.
given actually what I'm going to do, instead of Councillor Cashmore first, I am going to take Councillor Denise Lee since she's tabled the amendment, and we'll move Denise further up the order. So Denise, Councillor Lee, could you speak?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Internal discipline should always be the foundation for the pursuit of external revenue. This budget's got a number of initiatives for the latter, for gaining revenue, and it also has a number of measures that will drain revenue. And our largest source of revenue is, of course, Aucklanders who pay their rates. 90% of ratepayers pay their bills by instalments, and their last instalment was due Monday of this week. So what do they think when they open their envelope or their online invoice and think about what it is that they're about to pay with their hard-earned money? What we decide to do today can't be divorced from the reality of how ratepayers believe we are tracking when it comes to value for money and how they've viewed our historic performance to date. We're finally through our transition to a single rating system, and now what we advertise as a rates increase will in fact be that rates increase. But prior to that, we've indicated one thing, and it's entirely being something else. In fact, we've had an Auckland-wide rates increase of just 10% a very short time ago, and as demonstration of the local impact of that, and yes, I acknowledge it's inside a revaluation setting, my local ward was 15%. But the year before, when it wasn't a reval year, it was 6%. We know revaluations are coming again, and our reports, in fact this report here warns us of coming inflationary pressure. So this year is the year to do the right thing. I note that in this proposal, the wording for the living wage is that it be offset by savings, and the same should apply here for 2%. Our reports also put a positive spin on maintaining pressure on the council group to achieve ongoing savings of at least 3%, and that's to offset the 2.5% rate rise. Why can't we have the same discipline for 2%? We know we can do better. In your mind, I know now, pops the areas where we can. Procurement, staffing, non-effective use of assets, duplication of services. These aren't trite call-outs, they're real. And I want to pick up on Wayne's point on the mix of what it is that we see here today. So the sheet that you saw on your screen you've been handed here today is based on the mix that we see in this proposal. Things can shift around. That's our job, and it's our governance job. I'm asking us to do better. And if you think that the term better applies to items like the living wage, finding ways to fund AT's major events, addressing homelessness, investigation of mass transit solutions, all items in this budget, then it applies here. And it applies here, and this our first item and our most visible and impactful to the very people that we serve. I'm asking us to do better.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Right, well, I have Councillors Cashmore, Sayers, Hulse, Wayne Walker, Councillor Fletcher, Councillor Simpson and Councillor Hills. So we are speaking to A and B, but also the amendment, obviously.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will be quite brief. The reality is we have record population growth in this city. As the Mayor said, 45,000 people last year and expected to be even more this year. We are pushing the budget tightly at 2.5%. You are not going to run this big operation by continuing to squeeze its funding mechanisms. If you think of the productivity lost by the private sector through congestion and by the private motorists and their commuting backwards and forwards, whether it's on PT or whether it's on road, or a cycle for that matter, their lost inefficiency costs them, it is estimated by some people, $3 billion a year. That loss of production affects each and every Aucklander, affects each and every New Zealander. We need to be able to find smarter ways of funding more money into local government to deliver more infrastructure. Now, I'm not advocating for massive rate increases, but I do believe we have to find smarter ways to fund infrastructure that's more fairly balanced across the whole of the populace and economy. Although 2% is laudable, council's inflation is over 3%, and our growth in population is also over 3%. So those figures have a great bearing upon the business that is Auckland Council. So 2.5% is tight, and when we start the discussions on the long-term plan next week, for decisions making this time next year, we are going to have to think long and hard about our funding instruments and how and what we are going to do. And it will be tough decisions, tougher than today's.
Thank you. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When I was out campaigning, the thing that really struck me was the number of people who were actually on fixed incomes. People who had genuine concerns about rate rises. I'm mindful that our first duty is to the ratepayers and not to special interest groups who want ratepayers' money for their pet projects. The borrow, spend and tax them again model is a recipe for disaster. It will send Auckland Council broke. If Auckland Council is to keep rates low, then to balance the financial formula, surplus has to be created through savings for there to be any hope for Council's ability to accelerate the capital investment programs we so desperately need in housing and transport. You simply can't lower rates without lowering costs. I'm saying that we as councillors and governors of this city must lead. We must lead. In my experience, all organisations can make efficiency gains. However, they will only do that if tough decisions are made and they are forced to find those gains. As we've heard, a 2% rate increase means that the council organisation will have to find $7.5 million in savings from the budget. Not a big goal, I would have thought, against this total annual budget that we're going to recommend to be signed off of an increase to $4.2 billion. There are many budgets across Auckland Council that can share in the cost saving of $4.5 million without touching frontline services. I made a pledge not to increase rates any more than 2%. Who else is going to hold the flame to Council's feet on behalf of ratepayers if we don't? So I'm standing by my pledge, and I'll be voting against any rate increases of more than 2%. I'll be voting with a very clear conscience, and I am respectfully calling upon the other politicians who made similar promises that now sit around this table to do the same.